Welcome back into Buccaneers Total Access. First half of the show, we had head coach Todd Bowles. Now, I'm so excited to be joined by Director of Performance Science, Dave Hamilton. Dave, thanks for being with us.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
And there was a big win, big celebration. I'm sure there was a lot of celebrating. So I feel like I appreciate that you're still willing to come in the midst of all the holidays, in the midst of all the chaos. I very much appreciate it. And I feel like your role is one that our fans are super interested in, especially when we've done some videos with you this last year at training camp and some other things. People are so intrigued by all of the stuff that now encompasses sports science. So I'm really excited to get into all of it. And before we do that, I'd love to hear just what it's like for you to be a part of a big win like that. And we hear from coaches, we hear from players, but there are so many other staff members that are a part of making games like that possible. So what's that like for you?
Yeah, I mean, anytime you get a win in this league always feels special because they're never given. But yeah, yesterday I think to bounce back from the previous week the way that we did, I think was huge. And it's just nice to know that at this point there's a lifeline and everything's still kind of going and moving in the right direction where we kind of want to be. So it was a big win, and then obviously the game after followed, helped a lot. So yeah, all to play for. It's exciting, I think.
Yeah, it's a great time of year. I mean, you just couldn't write it any better in a lot of ways than coming down to the last week against your rival at home for the playoff spot. So for people who aren't aware of Director of Performance Science, tell them exactly what your role is here and kind of what that means.
So the role itself is really geared around removing subjectivity from performance decisions. It encompasses like working with multiple departments to try and work with understanding how can we mitigate the risk of injury, how can we make sure athletes arrive at game day feeling fresh and ready to perform, working with coaches on some of the intrinsic details of practice load and kind of the macro look of how we progressing through a season. And so we'll do things like when athletes come and they join our program, we want to understand from a profiling standpoint, what are the physical attributes that they have, where are potentially some opportunities for us to make quick gains so that they can perform more effectively on the field. If we have any athletes who are unfortunate enough to get injured, it's about how do we expedite that return to play, working with medical. And so to do that, we'll do benchmarking and understanding of some sort of strength diagnostic work, so we know where they're at right now, where do they need to get to in order to be able to perform again. And then, like I say, a big piece of it for us is wearables. So we're going to look at how guys are sleeping, how much work they're doing on the field, how much work they do off the field, and then ultimately, what's the impact of that work on their ability to perform on the weekend. So yeah, it's kind of all-encompassing to some degree. I would break it down almost into three pillars. The first pillar being, let's make sure we have our athletes available to compete. So that's a big kind of screening, injury prevention standpoint. Then we want to get the athletes to be the best physical athlete they can be on the field. So then you're looking at how do I make them better at their particular position or the demands of the game. And then the third piece is when they arrive at game day, we want to make sure that they're fresh. Because if they arrive at game day carrying any amounts of fatigue, then that's going to impact their ability to perform on the field. So it's kind of three pillars that we try and manage across all departments and work with everyone to put together a better program.
And I imagine a lot of people are like, how do you get this job? What is the background for someone to do something like this? So what was your background and how did you get to this point? How does someone become qualified for sports science?
I am the nephew of Jason Elias. No. That's a joke.
I could sense from the accent, especially.
Yeah, no, there you go. I'm actually from Texas.
Yeah.
So, no, I did my degree in sports science in the UK. And then I did my master's in exercise science or strength conditioning through Edith Cowan in Australia. I worked with the Great Britain Olympic team for 2 Olympic cycles. I then worked for the USA Olympic team for Rio. All obviously doing what I'm doing, strength conditioning, sports science. And then I went to Penn State for 3 years. And then I was fortunate enough to land here at the Bucs.
That's pretty cool. And what would you say is a typical day or week for you? What would your schedule look like in the way you're spending your time to do all those things you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, so the first step is, let's say we've had a game on Sunday. We're going to come in on a Monday morning and we're going to go through the game data. So we're going to look through that. We're going to work out what was the load for the players. We then go from an individual standpoint and look at how did this week's game look relatively to previous games they've had. how was their practice load the week prior. And we look at all that information and start to garnish whether an athlete is potentially overworked or underworked in a good place, and we'll make some decisions there. We also have potential injuries that have occurred on that game day, and we're just trying to, as best we can, start to piece together what is the pathway back, the return to play for them. So Monday is very much about game data and then getting reports out to all the relevant parties. So the performance team will get information about player load, how much work people have done, who is now on our watch list, like based on the information we've learned, like what do we need to be careful of going into Wednesday, Thursday, Friday practice. A bigger picture or oversight of the previous week is put together. Here's what we did, here's what the outcome is, and here's some thoughts going into next week if we want to make sure we're in a good place. And then Wednesday, we're into practice as normal, Wednesday, Thursday. So in that case, we're looking at individual athletes and trying to manage some of their practice load if they need it. So ultimately, based on that third pillar that I spoke about when they come to game day, have we made sure they're fresh or have we made them fatigued? And it's not always easy to ensure that everyone's fresh because there's work that needs to get done and coaches want to get their X and O's completed.
And it's a long season.
And it's a long season and a lot we're kind of looking at. But to the best of our ability, we're going to take those starters, we're going to try and tweak little reps here and there and plays and elements of their indie period to make them feel a little bit better going into game day. Outside of that, we got lift sessions. We're going to do some analysis on what we call neuromuscular fatigue. So the guys will come in on a Wednesday, they'll get on a force plate, they'll do a jump for us. When they do that jump, we're looking at effectively their neuromuscular system, which is their ability to do speed, power, reactivity. And by the type of technique that they'll use to complete the jump, they'll do it the same as always, but we can see little changes underneath the hood of their system that tells us whether there's fatigue. So we'll use that to then have a conversation about, do we need to manage this athlete? Is he in a good place or a bad place?
Just from one jump, essentially,
it's three jumps, but it's a lot of normative data that we have for them. So we start to understand, is this a meaningful change, positively or negatively for them? We'll do wellness, which is very much subjective, their opinion on how much muscle soreness they have, how much sleep did they have, what's their mood right now or energy. So we're getting an insight into how they're generally tolerating the work. So we have that on Wednesday. Friday, we're going to look at some hormonal data, so a saliva sample that will tell us about their testosterone and cortisol. That's another indicator of whether they're in a state of stress or recovery. And you're taking all that information, you're looking at the practice load. Now we're trying to refine what's going on Thursday, Friday for those individuals, and we're getting a nice picture of where the team is at as we progress, as you said, through the season. They have all their wearables on the field, so they've got the GPS. We can see how far they run, how fast they run, how many times they accelerate, how many times they decelerate. So all that information is telling us at the front end of the equation, how much work are they doing? And then the hormone stuff, the jump data, the wellness, that's telling us how are they responding to that? And that's the equation I was talking about that I wasn't very clear about at the beginning.
Yeah, no, this makes sense.
But that's the equation.
Yeah.
So then we're using that to then have meaningful conversations.
Very cool. We're talking to Director of Performance Science, Dave Hamilton. How have you seen the ways that all the different departments have to work together to accomplish what you're talking about? I mean, you have a nutrition team, you have a sports science team, you have a strength and conditioning, even rehab, you have the training staff. That's a lot of people all dealing with the idea of guys being at their peak selves. So what are the ways you guys all try to share data and work together in that?
Yeah, I mean, number one, it's where we're located. So the fact that our offices and that workspace is together always helps having kind of those corridor conversations or those quick kind of conversations on an athlete. And then another piece of it or a layer is constant updates and reports every day. So every day there's a report that will go out giving a quick little brief of what happened and where everyone is now, kind of the situ of the group. So if you see it, like the first part of the report is going to be where the team is at. Then we're going to look at, here's some insights on position groups, here's some insights or watch lists for individuals. So that comes out every day. So immediately everybody's getting that email from coaches to personnel to performance staff. So there's kind of a clear understanding of the data that we collect. Read the news. This is the news for the day. And then obviously everybody is an expert in their area and they're going to start making insights, and those insights will involve another conversation and just making sure that they're drawing on all the right skill sets and make sure all the right people and personnel know so that the changes happen. Otherwise, it's just a great idea that nothing kind of transpires. So, yeah, the communication is fairly fluid, but there's definitely a formal element of making sure everybody's getting the same piece of information, singing from the same hymn sheet. That's a Christmas reference.
I love that. So timely. And tell me, also, I have to imagine that getting coaches and front office people and players themselves to buy in is very important. What are the ways that you guys have seen that from this organization, and the ways you even try to help with the buy-in to understand what you guys are trying to do?
Yeah, I think Jason Light very early on had a clear understanding of what he wanted to achieve with regards to his performance staff and how they interacted with coaches. So I've been in this role for 6 years, and I believe it was kind of his baby, this kind of concept of putting it in place. So I think when you have that from ownership, they kind of understand and appreciate that the world we live in now, in the performance environment that we live in, is very much data-driven. Like there's no really hiding from it. The NFL is promoting it. And so making sure you have the right personnel who can take that data, use it effectively, and then have the right people on the bus, who are going to want to work together, is a big piece of it. Because I've definitely been, and I've seen in other locations where you can have conflict, and as much as you're trying to get the data out there, it doesn't really go anywhere. So having the right people on board is critical. And like I say, having those senior stakeholders and ownership seeing the value in it, it only helps us be more effective at what we want to do as a group.
Have you had any instances where you have evidence or an example of where something you guys have done has helped that you've been able to even take to players or coaches or someone to explain, like, as part of that buy-in, or something where you can tangibly show a player or someone like, hey, look at the difference this made?
Yeah.
Can you not say what they are?
Plenty of times that there'll be situations where there is recommendations, but the reality of practice and players' availability, number of players we can have available, makes it very difficult to do everything everybody wants.
Right.
And so sometimes you're going to say, there's an X amount of chance that this happens. You can't do a lot about it, and it happens. So that kind of, in a good and bad way, it reinforces the values of what we do.
But they're also just limitations.
In a negative way, we unfortunately got the worst outcome of what we wanted. So it's always a balance of wants versus needs. Like, what do we need to do versus what do we want to do?
Yeah.
And I think as you get closer to, the working end of the season, it becomes more about needs. Like, we need to get this done versus those additional wants. And the more you can prioritize and think of what's going to move the performance needle today and pull away some of the junk stuff that's just the fluff and really prioritize, that becomes important. And that's where working as a team to prioritize what's important is critical.
Yeah. We're going to take a quick break here. We're talking to Director of Performance Science Dave Hamilton on Buccaneers Total Access, brought to you by Advent Health. This is Buccaneers Radio. Welcome back into Buccaneers Total Access, brought to you by Advent Health. We are talking to Director of Performance Science, Dave Hamilton. We talked about how obviously data is such a huge part of what you guys do to be able to do your jobs, and you mentioned some of the ways you accept that data. I know that the GPS one in particular is so interesting. What are all of the things that it tells you, and when are guys wearing it, and everything that comes out of the specific GPS thing?
Yeah, so they don't wear it game day. They use another system called Zebra, which is based through a chip in their pads, and then there's mini cameras in the stadiums, and we're able to take that data and convert it into what we use with regards to the readouts, the metrics that you're talking about. So in practice, they're going to wear a GPS unit. It sits between their shoulder blades, and it's GPS because it works with the satellites in the sky.
Wow.
And so those satellites are going to be able to pinpoint where you are on the Earth, and then because of the speed in which they're being read, 10 hertz, so 10 times per second, it knows where you are. And then based on that, it's what we call time motion analysis. So if you were here at 10, and now you're here at 10:01, it's able to calculate how far you were, the distance you traveled, using basic physics, and you're going to work the the speed in which you got there, etc. And then within that unit, there's also what we call an accelerometer, a triaxial accelerometer, which means that it's going to know whether you move this direction, that direction, and up and down. And so that helps with player load. So when a player gets hit or they accelerate, it's picking up that G-force of movement. So you have the satellite, plus you have that. So then what we're able to get from practice is a real understanding of how fast you moved, how far you moved. As I said before, how much you accelerate, how much you decelerate. Because if I move fast, physiologically, that creates what we would call a strain on your central nervous system. But if you have contact, that's now edema, muscle damage, which is different. So you've got one that's creating like a neural stress, one that's creating a muscle damage.
Yeah.
And then if you accelerate and decelerate, i.e. I run fast and I stop as quick as I can, that's a lot of eccentric muscle damage when you decelerate. So you're getting these different physiological stresses, and the unit is able to give us an idea of, did they get exposure to more of this, more of that, or more of the other?
Yeah.
And as a result of the physical stress these athletes get, and positions they play are different, right? So if I've got a wide receiver, they run a lot. If I've got a special teams player, they run high speed and collision. And if I've got an O-line, they don't run a lot, and they shouldn't, but they do have a lot of contact.
Right.
So we're able to garnish from that kind of what was the physical poke or stress that you got in this particular practice, and then the recovery modality that we're going to advise is based on that type of shock that your system had. So you want to go a little bit deeper?
I'm all for it.
Okay.
Tell me all the things. I'm learning so much. I feel like I'm back at school.
Okay, so if I had a lot of contact, then I'm going to have a lot of inflammation within the muscle, damage,
Right.
blood, break. Yeah?
Yes.
So then ice is a great way to reduce inflammation. And therefore, if we get you in an ice bath, it's going to help you be able to recover and get back to play again the next day. If I did a lot of high-speed running, that's going to affect my central nervous system. And that responds really well to contrast, hot and cold. So in order to help that system replenish or recover, you might want to use more contrast work. And if I've done a lot of running, well, that typically results in muscle glycogen stores going down. So the energy source of the muscle gets depleted.
Here we go. I was like, you lost me, you got me back. We're good.
So now if we put you in heat's going to increase circulation and potentially support the replenishment of those energy sources. So it's important to understand what was the physical stress you were given, and now be a little bit more accurate with the recovery modality.
That's amazing. And we're talking to the Director of Performance Science, Dave Hamilton. I know that's all the stuff that is the most useful, but I also know our players to know where I bet all they care about is who ran the fastest today. Am I correct in that?
You are, yeah.
Tell me how much guys end up asking about this. Do you use this as some helpful motivators? How much are we giving the guys some of the data about the competitive side that I know comes out?
Yeah, so of all the fantastic data we do have.
With all these deep, meaningful things,
they don't care.
Yeah.
So they care about who, like you said, moved the fastest.
Yep.
So what we do is at the end of every practice, we will post the 5 fastest skills, the 5 fastest big skills, the 5 fastest bigs. And they get to see that every day on the board of who is the fastest. Now, jokes aside, by doing that practice of posting them at the end of every practice, it's important in order to mitigate injury risk that you expose yourself to high-risk activities.
Yeah.
And sprinting is a high-risk activity. So if you don't do it very often and then you do it, there's a chance that you
get hurt
yourself. You want tissue to be able to tolerate loads.
Yep.
And so by posting the speeds, we're promoting guys hitting high speeds more often, which serves as a mitigating risk factor for injury. So we're reducing the risk of injury by having them like to run fast.
Yeah.
And that's important.
I like that. And how much can you tell us about who ends up on those lists fairly often?
It's generally whoever puts the most cash on my desk. No,
forget this GPS nonsense.
That's also a joke. Don't.
Bribery.
No, so it depends. Special teams guys generally get an opportunity within practice to open up, so there's a good chance those guys get up there. It's really not actually the same 5 guys either side. We do it. I think we do a fairly good job as a coaching staff and within practice that it's not always the same guys, but also I think that's reflective of the population and the group we have, that there's a good level of competition when it comes to speed.
Yeah. Do you know who's hit top speeds for practice or games this year?
This year, top of my head, we have had a few guys in the 21s in practice. You want me to name names?
Yes, I do, very much so.
You do?
I do very much want that.
Okay, so Zion McCollum would be one.
Yep.
Josh Hayes would be another.
Wow.
One that may surprise people would be Sean Tucker. I think may have actually had the fastest in practice.
Wow.
Cam Johnson.
Okay.
They would be for the skills.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. I like that. So now also we know, so Shaq Barrett comes back, hasn't been playing for a while. What are the roles that you guys as sports science people can play in helping get someone, either whether it's coming back from an injury or it's just coming back from being out for a while? What are the things that you guys do to try to help with that?
Yeah, we're fortunate when it's an ex-player comes back, we have a lot of data on them already. So immediately with Shaq, we were able to put him through a little bit of a conditioning assessment, work out where he was, where is he right now. And we were also able to get him back on the force play and quickly establish, particularly the guy who plays on the edge, how his rate of force development is, how his twitchiness is, how his power is. And getting him on a force plate, we can quickly see where is he now versus where was he. So we use that to then target the way his prescription maybe needs to look for the next week or two.
That's so interesting. And then I know also, how much is it you are creating individual plans for every player versus just kind of, like you said, what the team needs to do? How individualized is everything that you guys try to suggest?
Yeah, I mean, strength conditioning and medical do a really good job. Let's be clear, like it's not me doing that, it's working with those departments to make sure that we're all on the same page of what needs to be done. But yeah, we as an organization do a really nice job of trying to individualize for everyone. And it's really not broad brush prescription. Everything is tweaked for you, for them, so that everyone feels, number one, that we care, and number two, that they're actually making gains in areas that are important for them. So everything's individualized best we can from a recovery standpoint, from the stuff they do on the field with regards to trying to help educate coaches on who can and can't go full today, to the work they do in the weight room and the type of lift they'll have to support their development. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and in the weight room, I know you mentioned the data you get from like the GPS stuff and the force plate. Are you also getting data from what they're doing in the weight room itself?
There are some technologies that we use in the weight room that are certainly insightful on week-to-week performances when they're lifting. GymAware would be one piece that's manned by strength conditioning. They'll do all that prescription. They can take that data and we can look over time. Are they trending in the right direction? Are they also starting to show potentially some fatigue in a movement or a skill? Yeah, there's definitely more to what we do, and we really want to have as much, like I said before, like we want to remove subjectivity from everything. So if we can get real insightful data on how well you're doing, we're going to do that.
All right, we're going to take one more break here on Buccaneers Total Access, talking to Director of Performance Science Dave Hamilton, brought to you by Advent Health. This is Buccaneers Radio. Welcome back into Buccaneers Total Access. We are talking to Director of Performance Science Dave Hamilton. Okay, so tell me, we know we play somewhere that it is hot a whole lot, especially as they first come in. All the things that you guys do to help manage the heat, but prepare people for it, and then also how much is it getting to be used to our advantage compared to other teams?
Yeah, so camp for us is the hottest time that we've got to kind of deal with. So there's kind of a two-pronged approach. The first being that we can't get away from the heat, but also we know the heat offers a physiological benefit. So there are performance benefits to training in the heat. But what we also know is you don't need a lot of exposure in the heat to get those benefits. So then anything we do above and beyond that kind of threshold is now just creating more fatigue for us. So when you practice in heat, particularly temperatures we work in, you typically will see a 20% increase in physiological stress, but a 20% drop in output. That's a big swing.
Yeah.
So in other words, we're not moving very fast, we're not moving very far, but it really hurts us.
Yeah.
Now that's great when other teams come because we will adapt to this heat, which means that when we perform in the heat, we're going to be a lot more efficient than other teams, and that's a performance edge. But as I was saying, in the camp phase, if we do that too much, actually all we're doing is we're accumulating more and more stress. And that means that we're just not going to perform very well. So then the balance comes in, or the two-prong approach that I mentioned, is where we now have to say, okay, we want that heat exposure to a certain extent, and now we're going to want to try and keep these guys as cool as possible so we can keep performing and practicing and get the quality practice. So then we'll use different cooling methodologies. We have the cooling benches, which guys can sit on, pumping out cold air. That's going to help them subjectively feel better. It's not doing a lot physically,
yeah.
but mentally I feel like I'm sat in a cold bench, and therefore I can give you a little bit more. The pieces of equipment that are a little bit better are things like the cold sponges on the head, the ice towels around the wrist, the AVAs, which is the cooling tubes we use, which stimulates the arterial venous anastomosis in your palms, which is the fastest way to drop your core temperature.
So just by holding this cold tube?
By holding the cold tube, it's going to work to kind of circulate cold blood through your system a lot faster. So it's one of the superior ways to cool down. Researched by a guy called Krewe in Stanford, that's where it came from. There's that, and then we have the cooling box, which sits at like 20 degrees, that the players can use as a kind of intermittent way to go from the field, cool down, and then go inside as well. So it's all kind of designed so that there comes a point where we get our heat exposure, and now we're going to start throwing a few cooling interventions at them so that we can drop core temperature and still allow them to practice effectively.
Do you use any of those methods on game day as well, or is this mainly a training camp thing in the hopes that by the time you get to game day, you don't need them?
Yeah, this is where it's a benefit for us, but then also we'll sometimes see teams come, and because we do have the cooling benches, both teams have the cooling benches, plus they have the shades, and they are effective, and also the way the game is played, there are always opportunities to get off the field, to sit and cool and get back on for 3, 4, 6 minute exposure. Right. So as much as it's an advantage for us to practice in the heat when teams play us in the heat, the NFL do a really good job of making sure that it's even and that these guys are actually cooling down. I think we see more impact of teams playing us in the heat when there are timeouts and they physically have to stand in the heat for 3 minutes is where it's exhausting.
Interesting.
Because they're on the field, they're stood in the middle of the field, there's nowhere to go, and that sun is just beating down on you. That's where we have the edge.
Huh.
And that's when they start playing after a timeout, you'll see the benefit. When actually the game is on and off and they get to sit down and come on, it's actually quite cool. And it's going to take them 2 or 3 minutes before their core temperature gets elevated to a point where it's limiting performance. Well, they may be off at that point or whatever.
Yeah, and then I know we're talking to Director of Performance Science, Dave Hamilton. We also have the indoor facility here. How do you guys choose when and how much to use that, what temperature it's at in the inside? And I know obviously lightning, that's a separate thing, but just from an actual performance standpoint, what are the thoughts with that? Yeah,
there's a number of things we have to consider when we use it. In camp, we can do 4 or 5 practices on the bounce. Going outside for 4 or 5 practices probably doesn't make much sense. So we would probably do 2 outside, 1 indoors, 2 out. Do you know what I mean? Find a way to kind of somehow unload that heat stress, or sun tax as we like to call it. And so by using the indoor as a way to just kind of break up that exposure, knowing that, the other thing I didn't say, but basically to get the physiological benefits of heat, you need 40 minutes exposure. That's all you need. We'll practice for 2 hours. So that's why we use the cooling devices.
Got it.
But to get the full benefit, you're going to need 14 to 15 days within a month. So if we're in a month and we've already hit 15 days, then we can start using the indoor a little bit more because we know we've got the physiological benefits. And now we just want to make sure that we're controlling the amount of sun tax and exposure we're putting on the guys. So that's how we'll use the indoor. But it's turf versus grass. And so now you got to look at the big guys and the way they put their foot into the ground and how much turf will disperse versus grass. They feel different loads. So typically when you're on grass, you're going to find that it's a little bit firmer. And so as a result, your muscles and tendons work well together. The minute you're onto turf and it gets a little bit softer with that rubber and it's kind of giving way, you find that the muscles will overwork. They get heavier legs. So there's always an impact to it.
Right.
If you practice on the turf all the time, it's no problem. But
your body's
when
used
you're
to
crossing over,
it.
if you have guys who have tendon issues then they typically start to flare up. So you have to be really kind of careful with how you choose and how often you do it, et cetera.
That's so interesting. And then also I know recently we've had a West Coast trip, we've had a night game, a 1 p.m. game, that there's a bunch of different factors when it comes to travel and then what time they're playing.
Yep.
What are some of the things that you guys do to mitigate that, of whether it is a West Coast trip, whether it is a Sunday night road trip and then going right into a 1 p.m. game, how you guys try to adjust for that?
Yeah, a lot of it, going to Europe was a big one, and that's not what you're asking about.
But I like that too. I'm all for that.
You're talking about significant time changes,
Yep.
and so then you've got to look at, okay, how quick can I get them to adjust to where we're arriving to? What's the impact on our diurnal rhythm? So hormone levels fluctuate throughout the day, and as a result of that, hormone levels can be very favorable for performance, or they can be negative for performance. You want to make sure when we play that they're in a good place. That's where adjusting to the time zone is critical. When we go to the West Coast, we're always going to feel like we're playing at 4 o'clock, 8 o'clock because of the time difference for us. So a 1 o'clock game there is like a 4 o'clock game. Am I right?
Yeah. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
See, we do it so much, it gets confusing. So that's favorable for us. So really when we go West Coast, we don't want to go too early. We want to go, like this year we got there and arrived midday. That gave us a nice portion of the day to adjust to being there, where we don't feel rushed and we're shoehorning everything in. We had like decent time between events. You're always going to sleep well the first night, because you're just the time difference, you're staying up longer than normal, so that when you go to bed, you've got this big adenosine drive in your head that makes you want to sleep. And then we're going to wake up, guys are going to wake up relatively early because we're 3 hours ahead. So a 7 o'clock wake up, we may have guys waking up at 5 or 6. Well, that's great, because for a 1 o'clock game there, they've been awake for 7 or 8 hours, and we know for optimal performance, being awake for 6 to 7 hours is perfect.
Huh.
So there are some favorable things to traveling to the West Coast, whereas if you went west to east, I'd probably see it a little bit more of a disadvantage.
That's really interesting. And does it matter from a nighttime game to a 1 p.m. game? Are there things you guys try to do to affect that, or is that just they're going to be okay?
So there will be different kickoff time strategies that we will use with the players. So if it's a 1 o'clock game, that morning routine and wake up and activities that we do are different to an 8 o'clock game. And in simple terms, if you have an 8 o'clock a night game, that's a very long day to have an arousal state.
Right.
Like, I know I'm playing at 8 o'clock, I'm up, I'm thinking about it, you know you're playing today, and it goes for a long time. So what we try and do is, if it's a late game, we'll try and make it into 2 shorter days. So we'll take a nap at like 1 or 2 o'clock. So now you can wake up, eat, activate, meet, sleep, wake up, eat, activate, warm, you know what I mean, and play. So you're trying to just cut up the longer day into 2 shorter days. That way you're not wasting energy, you're allowing yourself to get into a more favorable place to perform.
That's so interesting. And then finally, my last question is, where do you see sports science going in the next year, few years?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's always more and more technologies. There's always more evolution of this big data. So the more technologies you have, the more data you're going to have around. Now you've got to interpret it. I worry, I think one area that it could go is this paralysis by analysis. You get too much information, and now it's a headache for coaches. You're trying to have too much control on what is the human nature of sport, and the importance of this ecosystem of relationships drives a lot of success in performance, team culture. And if you allow data to start controlling too much of that, you're going to lose what is the natural camaraderie of team sports. So it's going to be a balance of using this data in a way where it's actionable and helpful versus it's overbearing and becomes, negatively impactful. So it's having that balance, having the right people to understand what's a meaningful conversation versus noise in the system. And that's the art of it, I think, the art and science of it.
Yeah, I love that. Well, thank you so much for coming on with us. This has been so interesting, and thank you for everything you and your department do for the team.
Pleasure. Pleasure.
All right, that's going to do it for us on Buccaneers Total Access, brought to you by Advent Health. This is Buccaneers Radio.